All these cards are maxed out, Mrs. Wilson, and they're all in your name. The bank representative's sympathetic tone did nothing to soften the blow of her words. She slid the statements across the desk, each one stamped with alarming red figures. There must be some mistake, I insisted, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. I only have one credit card, and I rarely use it. According to our records, your husband added you as an authorized user on these accounts. Your signatures are on all the applications. She pointed to a series of signatures that looked vaguely like mine, but with subtle differences that made my stomach drop. I never signed these, I whispered, the implications washing over me like ice water. I never even saw these cards. The representative's expression shifted from sympathy to concern. Mrs. Wilson, the total outstanding balance across these 5 accounts is $45,287.63, and they're all 3 months past due. I sat in stunned silence, my mind racing to make sense of this information. Just 4 days ago, my husband of 13 years had packed a single suitcase, kissed our daughter goodbye while I was at the grocery store, and left a note on our kitchen counter. Found someone who appreciates me. Don't try to contact me. We'll call about divorce proceedings. Now, as the bank representative explained my limited options, debt consolidation, payment plans, possible bankruptcy, the full extent of James's betrayal began to take shape. He hadn't just abandoned our marriage. He deliberately set me up for financial ruin. My name is Margot Wilson, 31 years old, a part-time administrative assistant at a dental practice in Portland, Oregon. James and I met in college, married young, and had our daughter Sophie within a year. I had dreams of finishing my education, building a career in healthcare administration, maybe even traveling someday. Instead, I found myself juggling motherhood and part-time work while James pursued his career as a software developer. All I wanted now was stability for Sophie, a way to keep our modest home, maintain her school routine, and somehow dig us out of this financial hole James had left us in. The thought of my brilliant, sensitive 11-year-old daughter having to face the upheaval of bankruptcy and possible foreclosure made my chest ache with dread. As I drove home from the bank, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Margot, this is Heather. James told me you were controlling and financially abusive, but now I'm seeing things differently. Call me if you want to know what he's been hiding. Heather. The name James had whispered in his sleep twice last month. The name I'd pretended not to hear, convincing myself it was nothing. The knot in my stomach tightened. Whatever James had been hiding, I suspected the credit card debt was just the beginning. When I met James during sophomore year of college, he seemed like everything I'd been looking for. Intelligent, ambitious, protective. My own childhood had been chaotic. Raised by a single mother who struggled with addiction, I'd grown up craving stability and security. James offered that, along with what I interpreted as love. We married quickly, partly because I was pregnant with Sophie, but also because James was eager to start our life together. He had a 5-year plan: finish his computer science degree, land a solid job in tech, buy a house, build a family. I put my nursing prerequisites on hold, planning to return once Sophie started school, but James's protective nature slowly morphed into something more controlling. He managed our finances completely, giving me a modest allowance for household expenses. He questioned my friendships, suggesting certain people were negative influences. When I mentioned returning to school, he emphasized how important my role at home was to Sophie's development. You don't want our daughter raised by strangers, do you? He'd ask whenever I brought up childcare options. Besides, the cost of tuition and daycare would be a waste when you're already so good at what matters most. I believed him because I wanted to, because the alternative meant acknowledging that my safe harbor had become a cage. So I adapted. I focused on Sophie, worked part-time when James deemed it acceptable, and gradually lost touch with friends and even family members who asked too many questions about our increasingly isolated life. There had been warning signs, of course. The unexplained late nights at work. The password-protected second phone he claimed was for client emergencies only. The way he'd quickly minimize his computer screen when I entered his home office. The growing emotional distance despite his continued control over nearly every aspect of our lives. 2 years ago, I'd found a receipt for an expensive Portland restaurant on a night he'd claimed to be working late. When confronted, James had turned it around so skillfully that I ended up apologizing for doubting him. "I was planning a surprise anniversary dinner," he'd said, his expression wounded. "I was scouting locations and now you've ruined it. Why can't you trust me, Margot?" I never saw that anniversary dinner. Instead, I received a bracelet ordered online, delivered to our door in a brown box. But I convinced myself it was my fault, that my suspicion had ruined his grand plans. I worked harder to be the wife and mother he wanted, silencing the small voice inside that whispered something was wrong. Even now, with 5 maxed-out credit cards in my name and a goodbye note on the counter, part of me wondered if there was something I could have done differently to prevent this outcome. I didn't call the number from the text right away. Instead, I picked up Sophie from school, maintaining a forced cheerfulness as she chatted about her day. "How do you tell your 11-year-old that her father has not only left, but has potentially ruined your financial future? That the home she's grown up in might not be hers much longer?" While Sophie did her homework, I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad, calculating our assets against the towering debt. My part-time job brought in about $1,800 monthly. Our mortgage was $1,400. Then utilities, groceries, Sophie's activities. The numbers didn't add up, no matter how many times I reworked them. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Heather. "I understand if you don't trust me." I wouldn't either. But James has been lying to both of us. I can prove it. Almost against my will, I found myself dialing the number. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was younger than I expected, tinged with a slight southern accent. "This is Margot Wilson," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You texted about James." What followed was a 30-minute conversation that shattered any remaining illusions I had about my marriage. Heather Davis was 26, a graphic designer from Nashville who had met James in an online forum for gaming enthusiasts 9 months ago. Their relationship had evolved quickly, with James painting himself as an unhappily married man trapped by a controlling, financially irresponsible wife who refused to work and drained his resources. "He told me you had gambling debts," Heather said, her voice cracking, "that you'd maxed out credit cards and he was working extra jobs to cover it. He said you monitored his calls and emails, so we had to be careful about communication." "None of that is true," I whispered, watching Sophie through the doorway as she concentrated on her math homework. "I work. He controlled all our money, and now I'm discovering credit cards in my name that I never applied for." "I'm so sorry," Heather replied, genuine remorse in her voice. "I believed him completely until yesterday, when I found some inconsistencies in his stories. Then I discovered his laptop open and saw emails about transferring money from joint accounts. When I questioned him, he got defensive and finally admitted he'd been creative with some details about your relationship." My hands were shaking by the time we finished talking. Heather had sent screenshots of their conversations, including ones where James detailed plans to leave me with the debt while starting fresh with her. He had systematically withdrawn money from our modest savings account over the past 6 months. There were even messages about blocking my access to friends and family who might help me, a strategy to ensure I'd have nowhere to turn once he left. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by evidence of my husband's calculated betrayal, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. The protective walls I'd built around our little family had turned out to be a prison, designed by the very person I trusted to keep us safe. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove Sophie to school, fighting back tears as I watched her walk through the doors. She was the only good thing to come from my marriage, and I was determined to protect her from the worst of this situation. Back home, I began methodically documenting everything. I printed Heather's screenshots, gathered bank statements, and made notes about James's controlling behaviors over the years. If this was heading toward divorce, I needed evidence. But even as I assembled my case, a crushing reality settled over me. I had no money for a lawyer, No family nearby to help, and few friends left after years of James's subtle isolation tactics. By noon, overwhelmed and desperate, I called the one person who had tried to maintain contact despite James's disapproval, my former college roommate Diane. We hadn't spoken in nearly 2 years, not since James had claimed she'd made inappropriate comments about our marriage during her last visit. "Margot," Diane's surprise was evident in her voice. "Is everything okay?" "No," I admitted, and once I started talking, everything poured out. James's abandonment, the credit card debt, the revelations from Heather. Diane listened without interruption until I finally ran out of words. "That manipulative bastard," she said with quiet fury. "Listen to me, Margot. I'm coming over tonight, and I'm bringing help." "I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm telling. James worked hard to cut you off from support, but he didn't succeed completely. There are people who care about you and Sophie." That evening, Diane arrived with a woman she introduced as Catherine, a family law attorney. "I can't afford a lawyer," I said immediately. Catherine smiled. "Diane and I go way back. Consider this initial consultation a favor. We'll figure out the rest as we go." For the next 2 hours, Catherine reviewed my documents and outlined potential approaches. She explained that while I might be liable for some of the credit card debt as James's spouse, there were options for contesting fraudulent charges and signatures. She suggested filing for an emergency hearing to freeze our remaining assets and potentially get temporary support for Sophie. For the first time since finding James's note, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe with proper legal guidance, I could navigate this crisis without losing everything. That hope was short-lived. The following day, I received an email from James. "I've spoken with a lawyer. Since you've been an authorized user on all accounts and benefited from the purchases, you're equally responsible for the debt. I've also documented your refusal to work full-time as evidence of your financial dependence. I'm willing to let you keep the house if you assume all outstanding debts. My lawyer will be in touch with formal papers." Panic rose in my throat. Catherine had warned me about this possibility, that James might try to offload the debt entirely. Without full-time income or assets, I couldn't possibly manage the mortgage plus $45,000 in credit card payments. I forwarded the email to Catherine, who called me immediately. "This is a scare tactic," she assured me. "He's hoping you'll panic and agree to unfavorable terms, but we need to move quickly." That night, after putting Sophie to bed, I sat down at my computer to gather more financial documentation. What I found sent ice through my veins. James hadn't just maxed out credit cards, he'd also taken a $30,000 home equity line of credit against our house 3 months ago. The money was gone, withdrawn in cash increments just small enough to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts. Our modest home, the one thing I thought might provide stability for Sophie, was now leveraged to the hilt. And worse, the first large payment on the equity line was due in 2 weeks. "Mom, are you okay?" I quickly closed the computer browser, wiping tears from my cheeks before turning to face Sophie, who stood in the doorway of our little home office in her pajamas. "Just some grown-up stuff, sweetie. You should be in bed." Sophie approached cautiously, her expression far too serious for an 11-year-old. "It's about Dad, isn't it? And money?" I hesitated, torn between protecting her and being honest. "What makes you think that?" "I heard you on the phone," she admitted, "and I saw the bank papers on the table. Plus, Dad told me before he left that you might be sad for a while because of financial issues. He said it wasn't his fault." Anger flared in my chest at James's attempt to shape Sophie's understanding of his abandonment. "Sophie, there's a lot happening right now that's complicated. Dad made some decisions that have put us in a difficult position, but I'm working on fixing it." Sophie sat beside me, her small hand covering mine. "Don't cry, Mom, I'll help you." The determined optimism in her voice broke my heart and mended it simultaneously. "That's very sweet, honey, but this isn't something you need to worry about." "But I already am worried," she insisted, "and I want to help. Ms. Winters says kids are more capable than adults think." "Ms. Winters," Sophie's favorite teacher, who ran the school's community service club. I managed a small smile. Well, the best help would be just being patient while I figure things out. Maybe some extra chores around the house. Sophie nodded solemnly. I can do that, and more. After tucking her back into bed, I returned to the devastating financial discoveries. Between the credit cards, the home equity line, and our daily expenses, we were sinking in quicksand. Catherine had been optimistic about contesting the fraudulent credit card applications, but the home equity loan was different. It had been taken against our joint property, and I had apparently signed the paperwork. Except I hadn't. Just like the credit card applications, my signature had been forged, but proving that would take time and money, neither of which I had in abundance. The next morning brought another shock. I logged into our cellular account to find that James had terminated my phone service. When I called the company from Diane's phone, they informed me that he had removed me from our family plan, stating that we were separated and I had agreed to obtain my own service. It was a calculated move, cutting off my communication while maintaining his narrative that I was financially irresponsible. Without a phone, I'd struggle to communicate with Catherine, potential employers for additional work, or even Sophie's school in emergencies. Diane immediately added me to her family plan as a temporary solution, but James's message was clear. He was systematically dismantling the infrastructure of our shared life, leaving me scrambling to rebuild essential services while he moved on unencumbered. That afternoon, I received a certified letter containing separation papers. James was offering me the house, contingent on assuming all debts, and $300 monthly in child support, an insultingly low figure given his six-figure income. He was claiming that my voluntary underemployment should limit any additional support. The documents painted me as a financially dependent spouse who had refused opportunities for full-time work, choosing instead to live beyond our means through credit card spending. It was a complete inversion of reality, a reality where James had actively discouraged my career advancement and controlled every aspect of our finances. As I stared at the separation agreement, a new emotion began to overtake the shock and grief: determination. James had spent years carefully constructing this trap, believing I would have no resources to fight back. He was about to discover how wrong he was. We need to be strategic, Catherine advised during our meeting the next day. James has created a paper trail to support his narrative. We need evidence to counter it. Proof of his control over finances, your attempts to work more hours, the forgeries. I spread my limited documentation across her desk. Bank statements showing James as the primary account holder with me, merely as an authorized user. Emails where I'd asked about our financial situation and received vague responses. Texts where he'd discouraged me from accepting additional hours at work. It's not much, I admitted. He was careful. People like James always make mistakes, Catherine assured me. Their overconfidence leads to carelessness. We just need to find where he slipped up. Over the next week, I threw myself into building my case. I requested security footage from the bank where the home equity loan had been processed, hoping to prove I hadn't been present for the signing. I contacted my employer about increasing my hours and documenting James's past calls to check if I was really needed when asked to work overtime. I even reached out to Heather, who had agreed to provide a statement about James's misrepresentations. Meanwhile, Sophie had grown increasingly determined to help in her own ways. She insisted on making her own lunches, took over several household chores without being asked, and even set up a lemonade stand on our street corner one weekend, bringing home $12 in quarters that she solemnly presented to me for the bills. "Honey, that's so sweet, but you don't need to worry about money," I told her, fighting back tears. "I know," she said with surprising confidence, "but I wanted to do something while we wait for everyone else to help, too." "Everyone else?" I asked, confused. Sophie's eyes widened slightly before she shrugged. "You know, like Ms. Diane and the lawyer lady." Something about her response struck me as odd, but I was too overwhelmed with immediate concerns to pursue it. Those concerns multiplied when I checked our mailbox the following day to find a notice from the mortgage company. Despite the home equity loan being less than 3 months old, a payment had been missed. I called immediately, only to discover that James had changed the account contact information to his new address and phone number. The representative could tell me little beyond confirming that we were now 30 days delinquent on both the mortgage and the equity line. That evening, Catherine called with mixed news. "The bank footage doesn't show you present for the equity loan signing," she said, "which supports our forgery claim. However, the papers themselves have a notary seal which complicates things." "How is that possible if I wasn't there?" "Either the notary failed to properly verify identity, or James found someone to impersonate me," I finished, the realization hitting hard. Could he really have gone that far? "People in the midst of deception rarely recognize boundaries," Catherine said grimly. "We'll subpoena the notary and find out." Just as we were wrapping up the call, my doorbell rang. Standing on my porch was a sheriff's deputy with another certified letter. This one, a notice of foreclosure proceedings initiated by the mortgage holder. "But this can't be right," I protested, scanning the document with growing horror. "We're only 1 month behind." "The notice cites violation of loan terms," the deputy pointed out, indicating a paragraph about material misrepresentation on the equity line application. As the deputy left, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Thought you were clever getting your girlfriend to contact my wife? Back off, or I'll make sure you and Sophie end up on the street by month's end." James had discovered my communication with Heather and was escalating his tactics. But he had made a critical error. He had explicitly threatened our daughter in writing. And that, I realized with sudden clarity, might be exactly the mistake Catherine had predicted. 3 months after James walked out, my phone rang with a number I recognized instantly. "Margot, we need to talk," James said without preamble, his voice tense. "Things have gotten out of hand." "I'm listening," I replied calmly, signaling Sophie to continue her homework at the kitchen table while I stepped onto our front porch. "The bank is investigating the equity loan for fraud. My accounts are frozen. What did you do?" I smiled despite myself. "I didn't do anything, James. You did this." "Cut the innocent act," he snapped. "You've been trying to ruin me. Heather left because of your lies. The bank is talking about pressing charges. I need you to tell them this was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding, like forging my signature, impersonating me to a notary, maxing out fraudulent credit cards in my name?" Each question was delivered evenly, without the emotional tremor that would have been present just weeks before. James's tone shifted from accusatory to pleading. "Look, I made some bad decisions. I was stressed about money, about us. But I can't have fraud charges on my record. I'll lose my job, everything." "That's unfortunate," I acknowledged. "But as you've reminded me repeatedly, actions have consequences. For God's sake, Margot, what do you want from me?" "Nothing anymore," I replied truthfully. "But I think you should come by the house tonight at 7. There are some people you should meet." "What people? Is this some kind of trap?" "Not a trap, James. An education." I ended the call, then turned to find Sophie watching me through the window, giving me a thumbs up with a proud smile. When I came inside, she wrapped her arms around my waist. "Was that Dad? Is he coming tonight to meet everyone?" "Yes," I confirmed, finally understanding her earlier cryptic comments. "Sophie, what exactly have you been up to these past few weeks?" My daughter's smile widened into a grin that reminded me, suddenly and powerfully, of my own mother's determined expression when facing challenges. "I've been building our community circle, just like Ms. Winters taught us." At precisely 7 o'clock, James arrived at our front door, his expression wary. He stepped inside and froze, clearly unprepared for the scene before him. Our modest living room was filled with people, some familiar, others I had only recently met. Diane sat beside Catherine on the sofa. My supervisor from the dental office stood near the fireplace, chatting with 2 other dental assistants. Sophie's teacher, Ms. Winters, was arranging refreshments on the dining table with help from 3 mothers from Sophie's school. My elderly neighbor, Mr. Patel, sat in an armchair, while his wife handed out coffee cups. Even Heather was there, having flown in from Nashville specifically for this moment. "What is this?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie stepped forward, a sheet of paper in her hands. "It's our community circle, Dad. When you left, I knew Mom would need help, so I made a list of everyone who might care about us." She handed him the paper, a meticulously drawn map of connections, with Sophie and me at the center, radiating outward to dozens of names: neighbors, teachers, parents of Sophie's friends, my co-workers, even distant family members James had discouraged me from contacting. "You isolated Mom from her friends, but you forgot about my friends," Sophie explained with disarming directness. "And their parents, and my teachers, and our neighbors." James looked around the room, recognition dawning as he realized these weren't just random supporters. They were witnesses to his deceptions and contributors to our recovery. Diane had helped me secure a full-time position with benefits at another dental practice. Catherine had worked pro bono to document the fraud and negotiate with creditors. Ms. Winters had organized a support network of school families who provided meals, childcare, and emotional support. Mr. Patel, a retired accountant, had been helping me rebuild my credit and create a sustainable budget. Together, they had formed the safety net James had systematically tried to dismantle. "You thought I had no one," I said quietly. "You were wrong." As James stood speechless, Sophie took my hand. "See, Mom? I told you I would help." And she had, more profoundly than she could possibly understand. Through my daughter's wisdom and courage, I had rediscovered not just resources I didn't know I had, but strength I had forgotten existed within me. The community circle continued to gather around us, a living testament to the truth that relationship wealth will always be more valuable than financial wealth. And as I watched James retreat, diminished by the realization of what he had lost, I felt not triumph but gratitude for my remarkable daughter, for our rebuilt connections, and for the opportunity to begin again, surrounded by people who truly cared.